Hi everyone, this is Tim from DigitalOcean again. If you've attended multiple of these sessions in our branch series, you're probably sick of hearing my voice, but we got a really exciting final session today with UXPin and Ash Oliver presenting on bridging the gap between design and development. As someone that works with both of these teams, I think this is going to be one of the most educational series and presentations of the whole bunch. I think there's a lot of lessons to learn, no matter what your role or department is at the organization. So we're really excited to have Ash. As always, if you have questions, there's a questions panel pane in GoToWebinar. I'll be monitoring that, and we'll get to all questions at the end of Ash's presentation, which is around 20 minutes. So if you have questions, please share them. As always, we'll be sharing these slides afterwards. So don't feel like you have to take serious notes. We'll be sure to share those. And with that, Ash, I'll hand it over to you.
Awesome. Thanks, Tim. All right. Well, I'm super excited to be here. As Tim mentioned, this presentation is around bridging the gap between design and development. And it's really a wide open audience. I think, as Tim mentioned, there's a lot of key learnings that you can bring back to your organization, regardless of the role that you might hold. So I'm super excited to be here. And just before we kick it off, I wanted to give a little introduction so you know who you're speaking to. So my name's Ash Oliver, and I'm actually a UX designer by education as well. So while I hold the head of sales and work on the growth team at UXPin, I'm actually a UX designer and am deeply, deeply fascinated by the whole world of design. So I've finished my education and have a professional certification in human-centered interaction and design. And among my design interests, you can see a few other things about me specifically in being a part of the Seattle community here, and loving to travel both for fun as well as for business. So a little bit about UXPin before we really get into the topic. UXPin is actually a fundamentally different design platform. And we're not going to spend really any of our time talking about the product in detail today. I just wanted to set the stage because it does inform a lot of our thinking, especially mine, in regards to how design and development can bridge the gap and really work more closely together. And so UXPin is a digital software product, and it's traditionally a full stack UX product. It really allows you to go from end to end in your design process. So everything from initial ideation and low fidelity prototyping or wireframing through developer handoff and scaling across the organization with design systems. So it's kind of an all-in-one single source of truth between design and development, which, as I mentioned, really allows us to kind of have a deep understanding and perspective when it comes to the actual teams that work together to do this type of work. So just a quick agenda as to how we're going to move through today's presentation. This is really going to be more of a lightning style. So you'll see a variety of slides here, and I'll pause along the way as we talk about things in a little bit deeper detail. But it's really intended to be more of a broad, high-level overview of some specific things you can bring back to your teams in order to deepen this collaboration between design and development. I want to first kind of talk about what the gap is and what are some of the circumstances that have created this block between design and development. I want to specifically talk about how this actually impacts us as designers or developers and the work that we're doing, as well as the business impact, the actual metrics that have negative side effects or consequences because of this gap between teams. We'll also talk about what we can actually do about this. I'm actually going to leave you with 5 key things that you can take back to your team to improve the collaboration between teams. And then I want to leave you with some resources. I'm a big fan of books, as you can tell from the previous slide. So I've got some resources that are my personal favorites that you can use to kind of further your exploration in this phase. So what actually is the gap? It's probably something that you've seen or heard of before. It's kind of dubbed the gap because there's this divide between designers and developers. And typically, what that looks like is, there's a breakdown in communication between the two teams. Typically, there's a pretty linear process that's very siloed or segmented. So design is responsible for their core responsibilities, their assets, their things that they're going to be personally providing to development, and development has their own set of tools that they use, as well as assets that they would be producing. I mean, they're really kind of segregated. There might be some interaction, and depending upon the project or the product, or of course the company, there might be a little bit more collaboration than in other circumstances. But ultimately, there's no bridge between the two teams. We're not using the same tools. Obviously, design and development are two different disciplines. And so when you think about design, typically these incorporate tools that are more image-based, vector or raster-based, and that doesn't translate very well over to development. Typically, there's a very different skill set involved on both sides. And this siloed workflow, along with the differences in tools, really not only breaks down the communication between the two teams, but also creates kind of this lobbing designs over the fence, so to speak, to engineers. And because of these kind of circumstances that are built in, and kind of how we produce work, there's oftentimes not just a whittle down of the collaboration that could take place, but there's no time or process that's built in to support actual collaboration. There's no scaffolding that helps to promote the collaboration that could naturally take place, even given the current state of using different tools and speaking a different language. So even if you do have somewhat of a bridge between design and development in your organization, or if you experienced some of the things that might help you interact with both teams, it's a little wonky typically. It's not necessarily a streamlined process where you might be able to point to actual systems or processes that help you facilitate that collaboration. And this has a lot of negative side effects across the business. So not only does this weaken the collaboration and communication between both teams, which oftentimes creates a lot of frustration or organizational challenges between teams, but it also means that there are typically wasted design or development cycles, or worst case, both wasted design and development cycles, which can lead to missed deadlines or even product or client risk. So we might have clients that miss a deadline, or a product or a feature that doesn't get shipped in time, or potentially doesn't get shipped in the manner or the faculty that it was supposed to. There's oftentimes a lot of inconsistencies between design and development, some that are seen more specifically on either side, where you might have a duplication of code or old legacy code that creeps in to the engineering process, or huge design libraries where you have V1, V2, final in all of your versioning and nomenclature for saving files. And so there's a ton of inconsistencies and inefficiencies that are promoted through this impact. It's really not a streamlined process, all of which have a dotted line to money for a business. Inefficiencies, inconsistencies, errors, team communications or frustration issues, these things all dial back to wasted money. So how do you start to bridge that gap? How do you start to incorporate systems or architecture or processes that help to promote that connection between design and development? Well, there's a lot of talk, especially on design Twitter or on the internet, around these unicorns, the engineers that know how to design or are familiar with UX design, or the designers that know how to code. And that's great and wonderful to find a unicorn or unicorns on your team that might be able to kind of sit neatly in the middle. But it's a rarity. That's why they're called unicorns. And it's pretty, not necessarily even just unscalable, but ultimately unrealistic for especially where we're at in today's industry and education, to expect that either developers are going to have a deep understanding of design principles, or vice versa for designers in code. These are specialties for a reason, and while there is really great opportunity for the two teams to come closer together and pick up some of those language or tools or skills that are more independent of both teams, ultimately you're never really going to find a team that is only situated in the middle and only all unicorns. So the first thing that you can really do, besides going out and looking for unicorns, is to build stronger design and engineering relationships. That seems like a given, something that seems pretty basic, but it's actually a little bit more difficult to facilitate in practice. And so the ways in which you can start to do this is really to have dialogue with your teams. If you are co-located and you have the opportunity to host like lunch and learns, where you can actually bring people together in the same room or head over to someone's desk and have an actual conversation, great. A lot of times though, that's not the situation. Maybe you are a remote team and being able to have that face-to-face interaction is a little less feasible. You still can promote this collaboration and discussion between teams by asking each other questions. And specifically, some of the questions that you might be able to ask are, if I'm a designer, how should I, or when and how can I share my design work to my engineering team? What is kind of the best mode of operation in order to share that design work? Another question that you could ask would be, what design decisions could be made first? Maybe your engineers know of some of the things that are easier to implement, or some of the design decisions that are a little bit faster to figure out. Those things might be able to be determined up front instead of towards the end of the design process. Another kind of flip side to that coin would be, what decisions are the most difficult to change later on? Being able to identify those things on the design side to be able to structure your design process, that's not just most efficient for the actual designers and the design work, but also easiest when you go to hand that off to engineers. Really helpful to know what things are going to be really difficult to make a change later on. And your engineers are going to be the best, kind of most primed people to be able to answer that question. Another question that you could ask would be, how do you give or provide feedback to your engineering team, and vice versa? How do engineers provide feedback back to the design team? What does that actually look like? Sometimes that could feel a little bit uncomfortable for developers to feel like they're encroaching on the engineer's territory, or vice versa. But this feedback around polish and craft, or maybe feedback on a better way to do something, or things to consider in the design, this goes in a two-way street. And being able to provide this feedback and knowing what's the most effective way to be able to deliver that, not just in communication, but how. Do you prefer to get on a Zoom call and go through this over the phone? Is it something that can be easily facilitated through comments, maybe in like a Google Doc, or maybe through a communication tool like Slack? These things, being able to actually get an understanding of preferences on both sides is really helpful. The other things that you could ask would be like, how and when are early builds going to be available? Designers can start to take a look at some of those early builds on the engineering side earlier on in the process, start to have a line of sight into maybe where things are headed, or catch something earlier, and that can help to reduce some of that friction down the line, but also remove some of those wasted cycles, or potential for wasted cycles. One of my other favorite questions to ask would be, how do you file and track design bugs? Some of your team members might be really familiar with this process, others may not. So it's always helpful to be able to ask these questions and be able to support these questions, and identify what these preferences are when you're starting to work between teams. The other two things I would say are really important in regards to opening up and strengthening these relationships is keeping lines of communication open. Again, it seems like a no-brainer, but oftentimes, if you're especially in an organization that has more of this siloed workflow and process, opening up that communication may feel very uncomfortable. And so being friendly, with one another, and being able to, ask questions, I think, is the best way to be able to approach this line of communication. Tools are also a really great way of being able to keep the line of communication open. We are a really big powerhouse user of Slack. That's kind of our main mode of communication. We do very little in email. But if email is more of kind of the bread and butter of how you guys communicate, that would be a good way of being able to go towards the path of least resistance. Go to the tools in which your teams are already naturally communicating in. The other and last thing that I would say is a good kind of concrete way of being able to create these stronger relationships is really building in time for that natural back and forth. I can guarantee you that if you are on the design or engineering side, that this back and forth is already happening. The friction really comes in when there's no time that's really built into the timeline or the process to allow for this back and forth. And so naturally, it's going to feel like a pressure cooker when you're going back and forth between teams because there's no time that's built out for that. So everybody's kind of holding their feet to the fire, and that back and forth is automatically going to feel a little bit more on edge. And so if you build in time up front to have this back and forth dialogue that's already going to naturally occur anyway, it helps to allow for some breathing room and for some opportunity to actually dive in a little bit deeper in this communication. The other thing, and kind of the second thing that I'll leave you with, is bringing in engineering early. This is a really kind of fundamental part of the process, and there's some concrete ways that you can look to incorporate engineering. This could include developers on conference calls with clients or with any of the stakeholders that are going through kind of the design brief or the design challenge. This could also include seeking insights from developers on how design elements would likely translate to maybe a web application specifically. Being able to have and be armed with that information up front in the design process is critical. And it's not something that typically designers will have unless the engineers have been involved up front. You also can run initial design ideas past developers so that any potential or even anticipated issues with code, whether it be new code or legacy code, can be identified, and you can make those design adjustments or understand those constraints more upfront. Again, any of this involvement more in the beginning of the process will only ensure that there's a more smooth and streamlined process as you move forward. And really, by doing so, you're able to clarify those goals and unify teams around a common solution. And it works both ways. You don't necessarily have to commit to a solution or to any design concepts, but including everybody in the process early on will help to facilitate that communication. The best way that I know how to do that is actually through something called a design sprint. And some of you might be familiar with this. This is actually developed at Google Ventures. And ultimately, it's a 5-day process for identifying and answering critical business questions through the kind of design process. So everything from the designing and prototyping all the way through the actual testing and validating, sometimes with customers, other times with clients, sometimes internally. And it's probably one of those buzzword type things that you've heard maybe just as often as the gap between design and development. This is the book. I strongly recommend picking it up. Jake Knapp, one of the authors, is very involved in the design space. There's actual companies that run workshops for this as well, inclusive of Jake himself. So the author of this book runs workshops. So if you're at an organization where you have the ability to maybe promote this or bring in a workshop facilitator around sprints, or even someone that might be naturally interested or curious about this, there might be an opportunity for you to start to incorporate some of this on a small scale at your organization. And it has tremendous benefits, not just in being able to bridge that gap between design and development, but actually bringing in key stakeholders from other various parts of the business, stakeholders, marketing, QA, for example. And really what the process looks like is in the 5 days, typically, you go from the first phase of an understanding phase or problem seeking and identification So you're really picking and narrowing down that problem to its kind of bare component and being able to identify what that area of focus will be. The second phase is really to ideate and to sketch out some of those solutions on paper. It really gets people out of the environment of, again, siloing design, what would typically happen in the design phase through ideation and brainstorming. You actually do this on paper, so you're not restricted or being kind of led down the path of more high fidelity mock-ups. It's just sketching out ideas on paper. And then you move into the decide phase, which will actually bring in a testable hypothesis. So you're voting and making decisions on your ideas in order to get to something that you believe will solve for that identified problem up front. Once you have those ideas or solid idea, you can move into the prototyping phase, which is hugely important. I think out of all of the design process or stages, the prototype phase is typically the one where you see the most collaboration between design and engineering. And this is where you can put together either a low fidelity prototype or even a really realistic high fidelity prototype that is the response to that problem call that you identified in the beginning. And of course, lastly, is to test, getting feedback from real live users, as I mentioned, whether that's with target customers, with prospects, through user testing or research with clients. Any of that testing that can be done before exiting the sprint phase will allow you to further validate what your hypotheses are and ensure that you're moving into the actual design and engineering phase with something that has some merit. The fourth thing is what I referenced earlier on in the kind of lobbing it over the fence, the design handoff between design and engineering. And there's a variety of ways in which this occurs. You could be part of an organization where, if you're on the engineering side, you might get a PDF with a bunch of hand-drawn red lines or a red line document with comments all over the place and measurements that have been incorporated. Other times you might get something on the engineering side where it's come out of a tool. So your designers may use Sketch or Adobe XD or Figma, and there's a design spec mode in which they can hand off that design, and it is inclusive of any of those measurements or specification or documentation around not just the design and the assets that are incorporated, but also how to be able to implement it or what things to consider when implementing it. Typically, this is referred to as a handoff. I like to consider it more of a handshake. And that's because in a handshake, there should be a meeting of the minds between design and development. It shouldn't just be a lob over the fence like a relay race in which design is done, it's now in the hands of development. It should actually be a meeting of sorts in which you can explain why you made the decisions that you've made, how perhaps it should be implemented, or what things to consider when implementing, and walk through the actual specifications or documentation that's been made. One of the great things about UXPin in regards to developer handoff is that this is automatically incorporated in the tool. So the designer is not only designing and ideating and prototyping in one platform, but the handoff to development is actually happening in the same place. So it's, again, that single source of truth between design and development. And this will incorporate not just the actual design and all of the assets and the design system information, so everything from colors and textiles to the actual images that were incorporated, but it also incorporates the CSS code. And so you're naturally finding an area where there's more of that common language that's being spoken between design and development. And it allows not just a more seamless process and more of that handshake to occur between design and engineering, but it also allows for some of that human error to be eradicated. When you're doing things by hand and sending over a red line document, typically there are manual errors or things that are overlooked, or a communication gap. Maybe engineering takes the red line document, interpret it totally different than that of what design had intended. And so this really allows the two teams to come to the same place and get an understanding of what that specification for design handoff looks like. The last thing, as far as the tips here, would be creating a design system and a unified design system language or language framework. And ultimately, a design system is really a combination of things, and it looks different depending upon your organization. Sometimes this is a style guide or kind of a master global style guide, and sometimes it's a very component-driven or code-driven system or library. Ultimately, it is the common visual language for product teams, and its main purpose is to speed up the design process and be able to bring those two teams together more closely. And so, as I mentioned, this could really incorporate anything from colors to textiles to assets like iconography that's been developed specifically for the company. You might have even multiple design systems or libraries. If you work on a client basis, you might have a design system specifically for each client, especially if this is repetitive or ongoing work for an individual client. It allows the designers to be able to keep that efficiency and consistency up front in the design process because they're reusing those elements and assets across the system. It also allows the engineers to be able to utilize those assets and components. And the whole team is unified around that same system, that same single source of truth. So this is a kind of a visual example of what that looks like in UXPin. A lot of solutions either are independent tools for design systems, or organizations have built out their own design systems internally and their own kind of product or tool. But again, the kind of benefit of having a single source of truth in a tool like UXPin is that your design work is happening alongside of where your design system lives, all integrated under one solution, one umbrella. Everybody has access to the same tool. And so it really creates this design and dev ops around one key solar system. The solar system in this case being UXPin as the sun. And it allows for that greater efficiency and consistency to be shared across designs. So design systems are a major aspect of being able to create that collaboration and really bridge the gap between teams. The last thing that I'll share with you here is just a resources page. And again, I think in regards to design systems and design libraries, that could be an entirely separate talk. There's a ton of information in regards to design systems and design language, some of which UXPin has actually facilitated a lot of that dialogue. We were one of the first design companies and design tools to introduce design systems. And so there's a lot of great information out there, inclusive of articles, as well as a great ebook around why you should create a design system. So I would definitely recommend checking that out. But in regards to kind of the whole life cycle and bridging and narrowing this divide between engineering and design, there's some awesome resources out here through O'Reilly as well as UX Planet that I think would be really helpful to check out. So I know this deck will be disseminated after the call today, but this would be a really great opportunity to check out some of these resources. And I wanted to thank you so much. I hope that this was useful. As I mentioned, we could really do a really deep dive on any one of those 5 points that I talked about. I hope that this gives you a good smattering of ideas to bring back to your team and start to see what things could be fit. And I'm always available to have discussions around anything in relation to design. I'm a super big design nerd. And you can catch me on Twitter or Instagram. Feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. This is also the first time that this specific presentation has been facilitated, so I'd love any of your feedback. I know that DigitalOcean will be sending out surveys, but if you'd love to get in contact one-on-one, I'd be more than happy to continue the discussion and hear about what your thoughts are.
That's awesome.
Thanks.
Thanks so much, Ash. That was fantastic. I think one of the things I liked most is that if you're in a situation where you feel like maybe the process is broken between your design and development teams, or at least it can be improved, I think you gave some very practical advice on what you can do in the immediate to address that solution. So I think that's very practical and helpful for the folks that are going through and maybe thinking of some ideas and how they can improve things internally at their own organizations.
Awesome.
Uh,
Thanks.
so we had a couple questions. So we'll go through them now. And just a reminder to everyone that's in attendance, if you do have questions for Ash based on this presentation, or if you have any questions about UXPin as well, feel free to ask those in the GoToWebinar, and we'll answer those now. One of the first questions that came in was, and I'm paraphrasing here, but Ash, can you speak at all to any instances at UXPin where the design and development teams were maybe not aligned, and then what you did to address that? Any stories from your own company that sort of specializes this, and how you address those?
Yeah, no, we are definitely not immune just because we're a design, company and produce design software that, helps to, bridge this gap. Definitely doesn't mean that we're immune to any of those challenges. So, one of the great things I think about our team is that we do a really great job of communicating online. Like not just in the actual tools that we use, but in how we communicate. We have a unique situation in that we actually have two locations, and a bunch of us are remote. So we have a location in Mountain View, California. We've got another one actually in Poland, where our kind of first headquarters was started. And so naturally, there's a time zone, challenge. Naturally, there's a remote element there where people aren't face to face all the time. And so I think that's naturally lended us more into communicating online. But the way in which we communicate, I think, has really helped to foster that perspective and keeping everybody on the same page. For example, we really look to be as like detailed and thorough as possible in our communication. We really try to avoid, the emotional speak, so to say, like the things in which it could be interpreted incorrectly just because it's the nature of reading something online. We try to save like some of that, kind of like create critiques or briefs and things like that, where some of that more getting an understanding from more of the emotional side could take place through dialogue. And the actual communication in regards to what we're doing, how we're doing, why we're doing it, those things are really well documented in a variety of places. So the communication is really well documented. I think when you see a big Slack message come in, that might be daunting if that doesn't happen at your organization naturally. But for us, having these like thorough posts really allows everybody to stay on the same page and not have to read between the lines or go hunting and gathering for miscommunication. One of the scenarios that I think happened early on was at least the thing that is most closely in my memory was our most recent launch. So we did an update to the product and launched 2.0 in November of last year. And there was a lot of elements that were coming together. So it was not just the product team, but also branding and marketing and sales. And so I think that is a really great example of how this kind of framework can lend itself to other types of roles in your organization as well. We really talked about design and development specifically, but this can incorporate a lot of different types of people at the organization. And so there was some back and forth in regards to how we were going to communicate why we were doing this new release and kind of the thinking and ideology behind it. And we ended up picking a few key individuals, leads from each one of those sections, marketing and brand, in sales and in design and product. And we were able to facilitate, an hour-long kind of launch meeting and really iron out any of those last-minute details so we're all on the same page, and that information could then be disseminated to the rest of those unique teams. And so sometimes I think, being able to pull out some of your leads to have that dialogue and then communicate the message from there, if done effectively, shouldn't be like a game of telephone and should be more of an assembly line of communication. And I think around a product launch that could be really stressful, but is a recent example of how we were able to everybody get on the same page across the organization before 2.0 last year.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah. And I think the idea of communication is only going to get more important. DigitalOcean also a heavily remote company, so we deal with that, both like pain and then also like the need to sort of stick to well-written processes. And given what's sort of happening in the world today, I think as more and more companies are forced to go remote or have folks work remotely, that's only going to get more important. So I think that's very very applicable advice in for like today's workforce.
Yeah,
Um,
definitely.
so actually, another question for you that's more so. This was really helpful from a design development platform, but I wanted to ask you a little bit about UXPin specifically.
Mhm.
So you didn't get a lot into tooling necessarily here, but for those curious about UXPin, do you mind just speaking really quickly to sort of what makes you guys different? And then if someone is thinking of potentially migrating some of their actual tech that they use for design over to say a solution like UXPin, do you have any advice for them on that process?
Yeah, no, those are great questions. And yeah, I definitely wanted to keep this more tool agnostic for this discussion, but I have a lot of opinions around what makes UXPin specifically not just unique but more beneficial than the numerous design tools out there in the market. And really, it boils down to image-based design tools versus code-based design tools. And if you think about it kind of on a spectrum, you have your image-based tools on the far left. This is everything from the dreaded, Photoshop or Illustrator, if you're doing any UX work still in those tools, to the more commonplace like Sketch, InVision, Figma, Adobe XD. And then on the far right end of the spectrum, you have more of your like heavy code-based environments, like your FramerX or Webflow. And while those solutions are fantastic, I'm a huge fan of Webflow personally. It does require a little bit different skill set from the design side. And so not every team has those types of individuals or the time to really foster and grow those types of skills. And so UXPin is situated neatly and uniquely right in the middle. And it really helps to provide a better tool set for both teams, meaning that your designers don't have to know how to code. There's no new constraints or restrictions or limitations. They are in a design platform equipped with all of the same types of tooling that they would expect in an image-based tool. But the difference is that UXPin is actually fundamentally a code-based platform. So it uses the same front-end rendering engine as front-end development. So your designs are actually backed by code. And so when you get to that, handshake that happens between design and development, you're more in line in speaking that same language, not just utilizing the same tool. And engineers are actually getting something that's useful. What we've heard from a lot of engineers that have, been provided a spec or a handoff from other types of tools, most commonly on the image-based side, is that while it might give some contextual information like the colors that were used and maybe the measurements, it oftentimes isn't that valuable. And so it's either overlooked entirely or it's utilized at a small capacity, but it still doesn't really narrow that divide. And so UXPin is a really great environment for both teams because of that. And we believe that the future of product design doesn't create this superhuman who is a designer and engineer all in one, like a unicorn, but that design and engineering is merged as closely as possible. So a lot of the ways that I talked about today is how we think about doing that in the actual practices or architecture or systems that you could do organizationally, but your tools definitely have a large part in that. And so I'd say that the biggest difference between UXPin and any of the other solutions on the market is that it is a code-based design tool, but it's not as heavy or has a steep learning curve like some of the other solutions on the market.
Awesome. Oh, continue, please.
Yeah, I was just going to say the answer to your last part of that question around making the tool transition. It's something that we deal with every single day. And it's definitely not something to sneeze at. It's a huge decision, and when you have people who are used to and familiar and comfortable with the tools that they're working with right now, and deadlines that are kind of pressing ahead, that's a hard thing to make a change to. So we help facilitate a lot of that process. Most of the design tools on the market are kind of a rip and replace, and your team is really facilitating the training or the migration of assets or your design system. With UXPin, you actually get a dedicated account manager once you're an enterprise customer, which 95% of our customers are, and that account manager really helps to facilitate that process. So everything from documentation and training and onboarding and implementation to actually helping to facilitate that migration of assets or libraries into UXPin.
Awesome. That's great. Yeah, having a one-to-one relationship with someone at the company is incredibly helpful. And I appreciate, I know you avoided talking about UXPin, and I think that's really appreciated from the audience. I'm glad that we were able to learn a little bit more about the tool, because I think it's unique in the marketplace, and I encourage everyone to take a shot and check out your website and see if it might work for your business. Well, Ash, it doesn't look like we have any other questions at this point. So thank you again for presenting. I think this was an incredibly helpful presentation. Again, no matter your role, I think communication is so important, but specifically big projects that require design and development, you really, really hate to see issues arise just based off of bad communication, bad handoffs, like you said, the lack of a handshake. All of those things are really unfortunate. I think you gave folks some really helpful information on how to prevent that. So thank you everyone who attended as well. As a reminder, you'll get the slide deck after the fact. We're going to send out an email tomorrow with all of the slides and recordings. And if you have any questions, you can always ask me. You'll be getting the email from me. But as Ash put up here, you can also get in touch with UXPin directly if you want to. So thanks again, everyone. And Ash, thank you again so much. This was a fantastic presentation.
Thanks so much. I really appreciate the opportunity. I hope it was helpful. So looking forward to catching any of you online in the future.
Awesome. Thank you. And again, everyone will have a great rest of your day.
Take care. Bye.